Today on the podcast, we are excited to have Uri Brito, longtime minister in the CREC and founder of the website Kyprian Commentary. On there's a host of articles by different authors about Christ and culture and how the Christians are to engage with the world. And for that reason, I'm excited to have Uri on because he's been a huge influence on my own thinking and understanding of our duty as Christians and in cultural engagement. Stick around and listen to what Uri has to say. Welcome to Kingdom and Culture, where we equip the King's wardens to know his charge and labor unto glory. I'm David, and with me as always is my co-host Craig. And we interview thinkers and theologians from around the world to explore the themes of faith, culture, and the lordship of Christ. Yeah, will you go ahead and maybe introduce yourself and maybe even introduce what got you interested in this whole Kyprian culture kind of thought in the first place?
Yes, thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it. This is, apart from chicken wings and Brazilian soccer, this is like my favorite subject in the whole world. I would love to talk about Kyprianism because I think it's a kind of it's a populist PR. We can talk about other authors. We can talk about Martin Bucer. We can talk about some other of Abraham Kuyper's antagonist and the people who sort of shared his vision during that era of Dutch history. But Kuyper is an easy entryway. It's a nice appetizer into the feast of the Reformation. So I went to Reformed Theological Seminary, where I got my MDiv and eventually got my doctorate. And somewhere in there, I had the privilege of doing an independent study, and I had a little bit of some freedom as to whom I could do that work with. And I thought that I would ask the Honorable John Frame. And I had heard a little bit about Abraham Kuyper, but I thought this would be a great opportunity to sort of delve a little bit deeper into his life. And so I asked Professor Frame if we could do a 2-credit independent study in the life and the works of Abraham Kuyper. And listen, I had 106 credits at Reformed Theological Seminary. They call it the law degree of theology. I had never worked harder for those 2 credits than I did in my entire seminary career. It was 2 credits worthy maybe of 6. Everything I proposed, John Frame asked me to double. I said 1,000 pages, he said 2,000. I said 13, 15 pages, he said 30. And so that year, that 6-month process yielded a paper on Abraham Kuyper and Kyprianism as applied within the not only Dutch context, but also the American context. So that was where I fell in love with Abraham Kuyper circa 2003. In 2004, I started the Kyprian Commentary. So it's been about 20 years of a love relationship with Kuyper with a little bit of nuance, but overwhelming love for the life of Abraham Kuyper.
That's incredible. Going off of that, this is a little different than the questions we usually ask people, but really, could you give a brief explanation of just sort of Abraham Kuyper's take and thought on this topic of culture?
Yeah, that's a really, I've written quite a bit about some of the Kuyperian ideals, and what I want to do is let me just offer a little bit of a sort of a sketch of what I think is significant within Kuyperianism, what is worth stressing. Kuyper is the kind of man who delved into a little bit of everything. But to me, there are a few things that stand out that I want to always emphasize when I talk about Kuyper and Kuyperian ethics. And the first thing that is just abundantly clear, in my estimation, is that Kuyper had what I call an incarnational view of the world. And his view was not the kind of view that you read and came away with abstract lessons about worldview thinking, is that rather Kuyper's viewed the arrival of Jesus on earth in the first century, in the fullest of time, as Galatians says, that arrival was signaling a remarkable transition into a new way of being. So that the life of Jesus was not just a life that would come to earth and was a life of perfection, and then there was a death, resurrection, and ascension. It was that, but that signals something very different about the way humanity ought to operate from that moment on. And so Kuyper believed that Jesus became a human and that humanity compelled other humans to live differently. And it compelled a fisherman to live differently. It compelled later somebody who was a carpenter to live differently. It compelled an engineer to live differently, an artist to live differently. And so it was a new way of being he was introduced. So that was the first thing. So there was an incarnational lenses through which Kuyper read everything. The other thing that I think is very significant to stress is that for Kuyper, the role of the church as an institution was more than a spiritual role, but it was also a didactic role. So a lot of people today, especially in the two kingdom world of Westminster and Escondido, and in some ways the two kingdom world of certain people in the Christian nationalist camp, especially in the Thomist camp like Stephen Wolfe and some others, would like to view the church merely through the lens of this spirituality, so that the church's fundamental role is to equip the people, but fundamentally to prepare them for heaven. Kuyper didn't view it that way. Kuyper said that he one of his quotes says that the church may not be content simply to bring the gospel to the lost, but its primary calling is to lead those the Lord calls into a deeper understanding of God's intentions on earth. So that is a very radical way of looking at the purpose of the church. It's not just altar calls and spirituality, but it's also instructing the church of how to articulate a vision in society that affects society, not just that saves society into heaven, but brings heaven into earth. And that was a very significant thing. So the incarnational, the didactic purpose of the church. And then the third thing, which I think ties all these elements together, is that Kuyper believed in the fulfillment of the Great Commission. So Christianity is meant to be a force that carries the gospel into the world, and that gospel is to come into contact with the elements and laws of human life, and it ought to change and modify the elements of laws of human life. That's a very different message than the message that was being conveyed in the 19th century. And so for Kuyper, the Great Commission was going to do that. It was going to disciple the nations. It was going to baptize the nations. But then it was going to do the other element of Matthew 28, which was to bring the laws of Jesus into the sphere of human society, which means they would affect not just the church, not just the family, but also the government as well. And his partner in crime, who eventually became a friend, B.B. Warfield, shared these emphases, and that was kind of the formation of the bond between Warfield, who ended up inviting Kuyper in 1898 to deliver the Princeton Lectures, also known as the Lectures on Calvinism, which I don't know if you know, but the Lectures on Calvinism was reprinted by Canon Press with a very lengthy introduction of mine there, where I articulate some of these things.
Yeah, I actually just read that for the first time last year, and it'll change your life, man. If you're not well introduced to that kind of stream of thinking and cultural engagement before, or yeah, I mean, it was incredible. So thanks for doing that introduction and to the book and all that. So, building off of what you just said, first, Craig, do you have any questions, any thoughts off of what you just said, Craig?
Well, I have lots of thoughts, but they're like downstream, so we can save them.
Yep, perfect. We'll get there. So let's getting back into just the questions that we kind of normally ask. Is then from this, what is your kind of basic understanding of just maybe a working definition of what is culture?
Okay, that's a terrific question. You've probably heard of a variety of responses to that question. I want to propose a bit of a more ecclesial-centered definition of culture. And that culture is whatever overflows from the worship of God's people. And with that definition, you can have a bunch of subsets, and so I want to say that the fundamental structure of that brief definition, I don't want to elongate it or make it real tedious, but the subway of sort of understanding the finer points of that is that if the people of God are worshiping God as they should faithfully, then if you take the imagery of Psalm 23, my cup overflows, that's culture. It's the overflow of the cup of worship. So if the people of God are worshiping poorly according to human standards, it's going to produce a kind of culture in the home and in society that is going to manifest a disdain for the things of God. But if the people of God are worshiping God faithfully, following the general structures of biblical revelation, it's going to produce a culture that is much more prone to obeying the word of God and the revelation of God as other cultures in civilization. And so maybe the footnote to that is that it's not going to necessarily produce an explicitly Christian culture, but it's going to produce a culture that even if they're not Christian, they're going to desire the benefits of a Christian culture. I don't know if that hope that makes sense. It's sort of what Richard Dawkins said recently, right? He sort of came to the realization that with the invasion of Muslims in Europe, he's realizing that, boy, it was really good to have even those less than pristine Church of England people running English culture than having those churches become pubs or eventual mosques. And so this is what I call and this plays a little bit into the political element as well. In my Substack, I've been fairly forceful about voting for Trump. And I know that he's not a Christian in the biblical sense. But I also know that the thing he desires is the benefits of a cultural Christianity. And I think that is a very significant element of the political landscape that a lot of people are missing. And so that's what it is. Culture is the overflow of the chalice of worship.
Which, to take that to a further extent, it works on probably both sides, whether you're Christian or non-Christian, idolatry, still worship, creates a counter-Christian culture in the same way. Is that right? So it's like whatever you worship culture will flow out of what you worship, right? And culture will model your worship. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, you've heard it before. Obviously, you are what you worship.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying is sort of summarizing that premise that, yeah, so there is such a thing as a superior culture and an inferior culture.
No, that's great. Because we have limited time, can I jump into the politic question, David? Is that okay?
Let's go for it, man. Yeah.
All right, I got permission. So I am curious because we talked to Os Guinness, and I've heard him say this kind of thing before, that when you're voting, obviously he's British, but he talks about when you're voting against the greater evil. You're not voting for your best friend. But he will say it is wrong for a pastor to tell people who they're voting for. He would never say that because then you're drawing lines. Obviously, you don't have that problem. And this is something I'm working through in my own self, because I don't disagree with what you said. But obviously, it's a hot button topic. So how do you think through the appropriateness of talking about that openly? What is the role in the church to talk about that openly? And what context does it work? And what context would you not do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have made it very clear over the years, I don't want my congregation, Providence Church, to become the headquarters of the GOP in Pensacola, Florida. I don't want that to happen. However, I also don't want any Democrats to be in my congregation. and if they are, if they come as visitors, obviously that happens, of course, but they're going to hear a very heavy dose of political conservatism in the inquirer's class and from the pulpit and from my writings, obviously, as most people probably know. And so I don't want to make the homily or the sermon to become sort of pep talks for Trump or whomever it might be 10, 15 years down the road. But I want to espouse a kind of theology that in the end of the day, nobody will be doubtful as to where I stand. Now, practically, that may be that somebody might say, look, I think Trump is so close to the lesser of two evils that it might be best for me to vote for a third party. I have very, very good friends, like in the abolitionist movement, for example, who are refusing to vote for Trump, and they're voting for some third party candidate. I think that's a strategic error, but I can respect that. But especially for our churches in the CREC, we're going to be attracting the kind of conservative people that are influenced by a kind of sermonizing that only produces a conservative lifestyle, not a leftist lifestyle. The illustration that I think of in many ways goes back to the Donatist controversy in the early part of the church. In church history, there was a group called the Donatists who were very much in favor of a kind of purity test. And the Donatists were in favor of excommunicating pastors who at one time had renounced the faith when they were under persecution. And so those pastors, when they administered the Lord's Supper, that administration was considered invalid because they had at one time renounced Christ because they were being persecuted. Now, since then, they had returned to the faith and were, members in good standing, but they would say that administration of the sacraments is invalid because of their impurity at one time or another. I think a lot of modern politicking falls into the Donatist problem, which is to assume that candidates needs to meet a kind of particular political and moral test. And that philosophy, of course, ends up providing an even more impure church. Because if a congregation or a denomination like the one I'm a part of is not explicitly moving the arrow, I jokingly say, when people ask, what's my political position? I say, I'm to the right of Emperor Constantine. If we're not moving the arrow to that side of the aisle, what's going to happen is that the sociological forces are going to move the arrow to the other side of the aisle. There is no such thing as a third way. There just isn't. And I think what we have seen is that those who have espoused the third way have ended up being a part of the first way, which is the left way. And so there's a caution there. So I want to be, in summary, I want to be cautious not to turn my time in the pulpit into political pep talks, but at the same time, I want my time in the pulpit to reflect the biblical rationale that God is a God that conserves his revelation rather than is constantly shifting his revelation.
Well, and to the topic of culture, obviously politics is a big part of our culture together. And so it's naturally going to be an overflow of our worship. You can't help but have that. And you could say that one of the reasons why U.S. is in the place it is because of lack of biblical Christian worship. We're seeing the fruit of that culture.
That's exactly right. You see that in the evangelical ethos overall, because I think I phrased this before, that any kind of worship structure that demands almost nothing from its congregants is going to produce a population that's going to produce almost nothing when it comes to their political endeavors. And so you need a worship environment that draws people in, specifically that draws men in, and that worship's going to have to demand of them something. And because worship is going to demand, even the word liturgy means the work of the people. Because liturgy is going to demand something, a work of the people, that people are going to come into worship, and what they're going to, the end result of that is that if they're being productive in worship, they'll be productive outside of it. Now, by the way, just to use general language here, we all know, we've used this language a lot. All life is worship. It's true, but not all worship is created equal.
Right. Absolutely.
And so part of this, maybe to loop back around, I want to keep this idea of politics going, because that's a really important topic for our people, but also really tying into this culture conversation is our idea here then would be, if I'm gathering correctly, that our goal is to actually have a real impact on the public sphere, in the public square, right, as Christians. And so can you explain a little bit how the culture that Christians make through their worship, right, the theology that's overflowing, or the culture that's overflowing from the church, what is the goal of it in the wider world? Someone in our church goes to work. What's their goal there as far as culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, fundamentally, when you think of worship, you should think in the Levitical sacrificial categories, because I think the entire structure of worship. It's elaborated in Genesis, elaborated in Leviticus 9, in the book of Judges, obviously the Psalms, and then, I mean, we know the whole drill. The Gospels, and then the book of Revelation functions as a worshiping manual, a worship guide. Kind of a Revelation is sort of a worship. It's a bulletin for Sunday morning. That's what it is. And so, if you think about the elements of covenant renewal, which the Bible incorporates, there are five. We call it the 5 C's, right? There's a call, there's a confession, there's a consecration, there's a communion, and then there's a commissioning. All these elements have unique features that also apply to the church. Let's just talk about the. I don't want to overdraw on this point here, but let's talk about just the consecration portion of the liturgy, which is, let's say, it's the sermonizing, where you get a chance to hear the word of God preached, where the Bible functions as a two-edged sword that cuts asunder. You're opened up for surgery, and God goes inside and cleans all the yuckiness of it, and then he restores you. And then right after that, or before, depending where you are in the service, there is something we call the tithes and offerings, right? And however that functions in the church, I think that's a part of the covenant renewal model. The tithes and offerings is the kind of the consecration would be the economy of the church. So if somebody gives to God, he sacrifices to God, that is going to have an effect in the way he views the economy outside of the worship on Sunday morning. And it's going to shape his view of money. It's going to shape his view of currency. Currency, money, whatever, however you define it, is going to have a kind of sacrificial dimension that it wouldn't have if tithes and offerings didn't exist. But because the tithes and offerings exist, therefore, now the life outside the church is going to take a different function altogether. That means Christians are going to give. They're going to give to those in need. They're going to be hospitable with their tables. They're going to consider the health of the church, and they're going to supply the needs of those who have distinct needs in the body. But they're also going to encourage others who are not giving, who are not sacrificing, to give and to sacrifice. So just think of just that simple element of the tithes and offerings already prepares individuals to be economic beings, not just in church through a tenth of our offerings, but as those outside the church dealing with the economies of this world, so that when we look at the state of the government attempting to tax us to death, we're going to have an opinion of that, because God has already given his opinion of that in the Bible.
Oh, that's great. To your point about all that, so basically this Kuyperian idea that there's not one square inch over which, Christ doesn't say mine, right? Everything is the Lord's. And going back to the politics idea, the political nature of things, I've often heard it said that politics is downstream from culture, but I also just recently read a Substack article where it was saying actually politics also feeds back into culture. It has a cultural effect itself, where when laws are passed, it is necessarily moral, and you have to obey those morals that are kind of basically forced upon the people. So how do you think about that sort of use of politics as maybe an extension of Christian culture, or culture that is influenced by Christianity and things like that?
Yeah, well, the gospel is inherently political, and it's inherently political because the gospel is public. If the gospel were not political, then Jesus would have died in in a spare room in some Roman quarters, but he died in a public place and he was raised in a public place because his death and his resurrection, and he was vindicated publicly, right? Luke 24 says he was there with the disciples and he went up in the air. It wasn't a ghostly ascension, it was a physical ascension. So all these things sort of indicate that the gospel is inherently political. Anytime somebody tries to dichotomize it or eliminate the political nature of the gospel, they're failing that test. And I want to add one more thing, and I think that's the reality that we have talked about culture being downstream, but it's also upstream as well. It's every stream. But when we think about the function of politics in the message of the church, and I said before that if you're not moving to the right, you're eventually moving to the left. And the outworking the fleshly dimension of that is that when we think that the only thing the church needs to do is to take souls to heaven, or at a more sophisticated level, that all we need to do is to stress the first things, which let's say the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed. If we think that's all we need to do and we don't need to engage the political element as well, then we're misunderstanding the purpose of the Nicene Creed. I mean, what does it mean to believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth? Well, you're going to have an understanding of the implications of a creational theory in contrast to an evolutionary theory. And consequently, if he's the creator of heaven and earth, that necessarily includes Genesis 1 and 2. So what's the nature of maleness and femaleness? And what's the nature of the fall? What does the fall accomplish? What can man accomplish? And so the way we preserve the Nicene Creed is not by saying all we talk about is the Nicene Creed, but the way we do that is by talking about the exegesis of the Nicene Creed, which necessarily implies a view of creation, a view of work, a view of ethics. And these are all political, sociological things that we talk about on Fox News, on MSNBC, on CNN, on Daily Wire, wherever it might be. The war today, when I was in a radio interview recently, and somebody said, "What is the Christian battle today?" And I said, today the Christian battle is the battle for who believes and who doesn't believe in Genesis, because that's the answer to all political questions. I mean, it's all in it's all in Genesis. And if we failed that task, we're failing the entire political task. And the church will eventually, no matter how noble they may be, fall into the trap of believing that issues of sexuality are not issues worth fighting for. And then we know where that leads.
Yeah, well, we in the summer times we're going through Revelation, and it's one of those things where if Jesus is a king and he's bringing a kingdom, that's political by nature. Like there's going to be people fighting against that kingdom, people fighting against that king. And you're absolutely right. The gospel has to be political if it's going to impact all creation. Our political lives is an important part of that reality.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so in the days of Abraham Kuyper, there were obviously Dutch pietists that held to some kind of, some pietism in those days. And they were attempting to live as if the church is apolitical. And Kuyper, of course, the reference you quoted earlier, Kuyper, of course, believed that it's impossible for the church to be apolitical because the church is situated in the world.
Right.
And if the church is situated in the world, then no matter what season of history you're in, you're either pro-Nero or pro-Jesus. You're either pro-Joe Biden or you're pro-Jesus. There's no way to be, there's no third way, let's put it that way. And so that's just the reality which we live in. And those who have most attempted to forsake this principle because they thought they could find a purer way have always produced offspring that have drunk deeply of leftist, communist, Marxist, socialist ideologies. I'm telling you, it is just a fact of history that those who have cared little about the position of the church in regards to culture have produced an offspring that have most forsaken the gospel of our Lord.
Well, and I imagine many of the pietists would quote verses like out of Romans 13 and 1 Peter to talk about, hey, we just need to submit. And, it's kind of the pacifist kind of thing, just lay down our lives, and misapplying that. How would you use those verses to actually challenge the pietist if they were to use those?
Yeah, I'm always struck by the things that sort of come before and after Romans 13, and same with Peter as well. But Romans 13 kind of carries a greater weight. That certainly did during the COVID era. And what I would want to stress is that Romans 13 is a call for the civil government who has both deacons of righteousness and who has the task of preserving, proclaiming, however you want to translate that section, the well-being of society. And that well-being, in my estimation, is more than simply the execution of criminals, which a lot of people want to simply limit the role of deacons, the civil servants, as merely, let's phrase this way, executionary functions. That their only role is to deal with Sixth Commandment sort of violations. And however, you have to really understand that I think what Paul is saying in Romans 13 is that the well-being of civilization functions according to the law of God and nature's law. It is something far more elastic than the narrow view that a lot of people interpret Romans 13. So that's the point, is that they're deacons of righteousness, they're servants of righteousness. Righteousness rooted in what? What? In my estimation, Paul is basing everything he writes in Romans 13 on the basis of what Moses has written. And then what does it mean to proclaim the well-being? That means to produce the kinds of fruits that would lead society to prosper according to God's laws. And so, far from this being a call to submit to the government at all costs and in all places, Acts 5:29 says we ought to obey God rather than man. And so that's the principle I think that we ought to keep our civic leaders under at all times, is that if they are obeying the precepts of God, then we ought to follow them. If not, we shouldn't pursue revolution as a first cause, but we should pursue the reversal of those policies so that they reflect that which is true, good, and right.
That's interesting. So it's almost like more of a challenge to the leaders to live up to that calling than it is to us to submit to whoever's in front of us, that's a great way to phrase it.
That's exactly right. I mean, and the way to think about that also is in regards to, I'm sort of one of those old timers that kind of believes that Paul would never contradict Moses or the Psalms. And if you think that to be the case, then you have to realize that in some ways, the Psalms of imprecation, which were Psalms of curses upon kings and rulers, were essentially the way the Apostle Paul applies a passage like Romans 13, is that, if you do not follow God's ways, then thy will be done. If you follow God's ways, then God's will be done. In Isaiah chapter 3, there is this great passage where Isaiah describes what a society looks like without elders, without judges, without men, without food. And it's like it's an ancient way of describing Venezuela or Cuba or whatever the heck is happening in England these days. That's kind of what's described in some ways. But then Isaiah goes and says, but those who follow God's laws, and then he's got this great little phrase that I think one of our hymns has captured it. He says, but it shall be well with them. And it's a lovely passage because Isaiah sort of contrasting these governmental visions. One vision says, yeah, we're gonna act as tyrants over the people. God's judgment is imposed on them. But the fruit of the righteous means that even if you kill us, our children will end up eventually ruling over you. And so that's the premise, that we may not have immediate generational victory, but our children, our children's children will, because it's not just a matter of numbers. We are going to outnumber you, because you can't survive having 0.01 children. Our numbers will be far greater than yours, but our quality will be far greater than yours, because people will always pursue justice above injustice. Injustice only sounds cute in protesting of university campuses, but it never sounds cute when you're looking to get your grade after your test.
Amen. Well, looking at the time, we want to start winding down. So I have two kind of final questions for you. First, what books or resources or authors or anything like that would you recommend to folks who are listening that want to explore kind of this topic further and deeper?
Well, there's a couple things that I think are very helpful, a couple books that I think are very helpful. So let me just sort of put my cards on the table on these issues here. Let me just recommend three that just come to mind immediately. And I know I've written about this in other places, some book resources. So I want to equip people uh, politically, I want to equip people theologically, and I want to equip people liturgically. And so theologically, I want the whole world to read James Jordan's Through New Eyes. Right? James B. Jordan is this theologian who lives in Texas right now. Has a lot of health issues. I had a chance to work with him for 3 years. But I think if you read Through New Eyes, I think you'll get people who won't abandon biblical inerrancy. They'll love the Bible. They will love the Bible more. That's the first thing. So I got a lot of stake in this game here. The second thing I would say is I want everybody to buy my friend's Aaron Renn's book, Life in a Negative World. It's sort of asking, it's the Sons of Issachar kind of thing, asking the question, what time it is, and who are the people who can answer that question wisely? What time is it? How do you answer to it? So it's called Life in a Negative World by Aaron Renn. And then the third book that should be able to sort of just blow people's mind when it comes to liturgical issues is a book by the man who actually was part of my ordination process, by Jeff Meyers, and it's called The Lord's Service, The Grace of Covenant Renewal Worship. And that's a big book, I grant it. If you want a smaller book, your listeners can get a hold of Peter Leithart's The Theopolitan Liturgy that I have here in my hands for your listeners who are watching this here. The Theopolitan Liturgy, it's much smaller, 120 pages. So if you want to sort of have something more digestible, the Theopolitan Liturgy by Peter Leithart. But if you want to have a more grandiose, more exhaustive understanding of how liturgy works, the Lord's Service by Jeff Meyers is a great book. Those are three books I would say. First three books that came to mind. I don't think somebody can read those books and be unchanged. I think if you read those three books in the space of 3 to 4 weeks, I think you're going to have better church members. And I also think you're going to have much more well-equipped members who understand their role in society and what their role is in the service of God in the kingdom.
That's amazing. I've read Through New Eyes, the Lord's Service, and Theopolitan Liturgy, and all of them have been just paradigm shifting. I mean, it changed. Again, it was a lot like the book we were talking about earlier, Kuyper's lectures. I mean, it changes everything. Gives you a whole new way of looking at those things. So I appreciate those the suggestions. I also want to have you talk about your latest book, just briefly as well. It was War of the Priesthood. Is that correct?
Yes, and earlier this year, the War of the Priesthood, there was sort of an exposition of the armor of God, which is the way I've heard it most used. I've heard it used for church-wide studies, but I've heard it used by a lot of men's studies around the country and the world as well. I've had some people using in Brazil. We have some English speakers there from our local church, and also in England and other places as well. The War of the Priesthood is my way of thinking through what Paul means at the end of Ephesians when he talks about the armor of God. We have typically seen the armor of God primarily through Roman lenses. So we envision the Apostle Paul staring through a Roman cell and looking at a Roman soldier and saying, "Ha, look at that. There's a helmet. There is a breastplate. There are shoes."
Mm-hmm.
He's sort of like mimicking the image he has in front of him. But I make the case that the Apostle Paul is incredibly Jewish and Hebrew in his deliberations and discourse in writing Ephesians, and that the Apostle Paul is not replicating a Roman soldier, but he's replicating the armor of the priest in Exodus 28 and 29 and Leviticus, and also, of course, in the Garden of Eden. I think Adam was a priest as well. And so when you take, for example, the image of the garments and the coverings, all that image you see throughout the book of Genesis, in the covering of the fig leaves, in God's covering of Adam. You see it in Exodus, you see it in Leviticus, you see it in Judges. So the language of covering is a very significant theme because it follows that priestly trajectory in the Bible. So the armor pieces that Paul describes are pieces of the priestly armor. And the purpose of it is that the men of God will be equipped, but also following Peter's rationale, we are a royal priesthood. And so how then shall we then live if we are a priesthood? And that's what Paul is answering when he describes the armor pieces. We're living as priests unto God. And that priest, by the way, begins with, when you think about the helmet of salvation, the priestly helmet in Exodus has a name on it, and it says, holy to the Lord, holy to Yahweh. And that's what the Christian is called to do from his baptism on, is he's called to dedicate his life as a living sacrifice, as a holy sacrifice to Yahweh himself.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Where can people pick that book up if they want to grab it? And where can people connect with you online? I know you have a Substack and Kyperian commentary, so can you plug those things real quick for everybody?
Yeah, I'll plug just a couple things here. The publisher is called Noggin Nose Press, and you can just go to nogginnose.com, NOGGINNOSE, nogginnose.com, and you'll find their store. It's a real clever little publishing company doing really good work, publishing just really popular level material for laity that's enriching them in the Bible. And so that's where you can get the War of the Priesthood. But the two main places where you see a lot of my writings are at Kyperian.com, KUYPERIAN.com. We have a lot of writings there, essays on issues regarding politics, liturgy, household, economics, everything under the sun is there. It's just been a great resource. I hear a lot of testimonies of men and women using the essays for different studies in the church. And then the place where you'll find the most current of my material is in my Substack, and that's drbrito.substack.com. It's become kind of a haven for a lot of people to write because it provides a very easy format for people to read and subscribe to. So if you want to go there and subscribe, there's a free subscription and also a paid subscription if you are willing to give up that Starbucks coffee for the month. But it's all there, drbrito.substack.com.
Well, thanks again, Uri, for coming on. And guys, go check out our Patreon where we've got exclusive interviews with our guests, and also check out our website. We've got merch. We've got hats and mugs and stickers. So go check that out as well. Until next time, labora ad gloriam.